Okay, so the title of my talk is Glamour Muscles, Why Having a Body Gets You Nowhere, and I'm Sean Bolio, a PhD candidate at the University of Vermont. So I don't think I need to tell anyone here that AI is going through something of a moment, and maybe has been for a sustained period of about 10 years. Here we have some recent highlights covering computer vision, chip design, natural language processing, and protein structure prediction, along with a lot of credulous media coverage from the New York Times in particular, which I think reflects an institutional and cultural superstition about the magical properties of words. In any case, though, the accomplishments of artificial intelligence are legion, but so too are its deficiencies. At a more macro scale, we also see that the historical impact of communications technologies on things like manufacturing output and worker productivity have always fallen well short of their utopian promise. But this time it's different, as proponents say, which is, of course, what they said in the 2000s, and the 90s, and the 80s, but this time it could certainly be true. To say this is not to impugn the hard work of those who have advanced the field to its present state, nor to doubt the material gains this work has secured in whatever limited capacity. It is instead to acknowledge that every technology has costs and benefits that are intrinsic to both its design and the context in which it functions. Even though we've witnessed what seems like tremendous progress, we've also seen the AI programs behave in ways that cast doubt on their reliability and show a persistent brittleness that curbs their widespread utility. What we today call artificial intelligence is fully determined in its governing logic by the science of human engineering. Unlike living systems, whose social and physical constitution is freely challenged by life itself, autonomous AI is supposed to consist in the free selection of outputs for a given set of inputs, where every detail of this process is ultimately realized by human labor undertaken for the satisfaction of human ends. Although these programs are capable of amazing things because we've made them so capable, they have no independent notion of priority. They're not equipped to attend to and nurture those aspects of the world that are important to them for reasons they sustain, and thus are tools for and maintained by intelligence, and not intelligence as such. I expect this to be utterly uncontroversial. So generally speaking, we have methods of optimizing chosen subsets of the world, which have tended toward automation, and methods of choosing which subsets to optimize, which largely remains a human endeavor. Although it's true that some machines are programmed with the ability to add, remove, and otherwise modulate system components, and so appear to perform both functions, those decisions regarding allowable component types and the phenomena on which those components are permitted to fixate are clearly delineated by the set of rules that define them. They therefore depend on some external process by which relevant factors are specified. So for example, the data we use doesn't spontaneously pop into existence, and neither do the programs we train or the machines we run them on. It is only under conditions imposed by exogenous constraints that AI exhibits the truncated form of freedom it's rightly celebrated for, that is, the freedom to choose among received options. If either the material or algorithmic constraints, some of which are listed here, were ever violated, presenting, for example, as unplanned sensitivity to sonic vibrations, the corresponding program or machine would be rejected for failing to achieve what it was designed for. This accords with common sense. If we specify that our program should classify images, we don't want it to classify frequencies of sound occurring in the local environment. But it would be an error to regard this conceptual division between the specification of constraints and the processes they enable as anything but a useful contrivance, or as specifying a fixed direction of causality. If it suits our purposes, we can say artificial intelligence is a purely technical enterprise concerned with elaborating the tools of prediction and optimization. Or we can say it's a system of social relations that furnish the very conditions for technical mastery, that is, activities like providing the data, the programs, machines, etc. But neither level of analysis is by itself wholly sufficient or well-defined, because it is only by reference to the other that either one contains sensible activity, which is to say, a constraint only functions in the way that it does, given what it constrains, and how it interacts with or is supported by other constraints. This doesn't mean that technical deficiencies in any given technology will be causally resolved by non-technical means, rather that technical processes are themselves a form of social practice, ones we're not bound to but can modify or discard by nominally social means. This is evident in the obsolescence of so-called GoFi methods, whose relegation to the dustbin of history wasn't decided by purely technical means. There's no natural law that says that just because neural networks are better than GoFi methods for certain things, that they should replace them. Instead, it was decided by social practices oriented towards specific empirical outcomes. So I say all this because it is precisely this interplay between what a system is or can become and the activity it practically realizes that machines themselves do not exhibit, in which we perform on those occasions we mistakenly arrogate to machines the properties of life. That is, what makes smart machines unusual as adaptive systems is the independence of system constraint from activity internal to the system, given the actions of human designers. I'll come back to this point. So embodied machines, whether they're real or simulated, are meant to be systems whose expanded functionality results in special qualities that are inaccessible to more physically constrained systems. It's thought that embodied machines will better mirror the traits of their living counterparts insofar as classically cognitive phenomena like memory, perception, and representation are causally wedded to bodily action. Autonomous movement among and between otherwise immobile parts is what enables these systems to acquire novel information about the world they inhabit, and to change its state by way of interaction. So observations aren't merely subject to accurate or useful processing. Instead, the details of observations are actively generated and transformed by bodily action. Embodiment can then be understood as the total imbrication of action and perception. But this definition contains no necessary relation to physical movement, because the means of perceiving, changing, and traversing the space one occupies can be abstractly implemented by all manner of systems. Provided that language models actively participate in the social process of determining how language is used, rather than merely how to use language given its social determination, they achieve a linguistic analog to physical embodiment. What then distinguishes physically embodied machines from those of more abstractly embodied are the properties of the world they are licensed to observe, navigate, and alter. Physically embodied machines are thus distinct only in their manifestation of niche capabilities, those required for solving or reasoning about problems in physical space. Whatever amplification of existing powers occurs by giving nominally disembodied machines the freedom to move may be analogously realized by extending their jurisdiction to other domains. Just as the manipulation of physical objects might ground or supplement certain cognitive faculties, so too might the use and manipulation of language augment visual comprehension in image models. There's no a priori reason to think physical movement as such results in special powers. And this is because adaptation for even physically embodied machines occurs by learning to execute actions that are predetermined and therefore indistinguishable from those of more constrained systems, except in the quality of their effects. Although we might consider phenomena like language use as supervening on physical processes, and so intuit that the capacity for physical action includes the capacity for language use, we don't actually design our machines to be alive to the full richness of the world. If they're not already equipped for language use, it isn't something they can plausibly derive from any combination of actions they're created to perform, but an altogether different trait they must be reconfigured to express. All the instruments for optimizing action selection in nominally disembodied machines are then simply given greater purview in light of embodiment. Basically, we've expanded their set of inputs and outputs. Far from transcending orthodoxy, embodied machines merely repackage the idea of intelligence as reinforced selection. A constitutive property of life is that in forming and maintaining itself, it can, in principle, construct or exploit whatever affords it the means to do so. If it is adaptive for an organism to develop an affinity for sound or attend to fluctuations in temperature, then all that stands in its way are the viability of the mechanism involved and the likelihood of its discovery, which may be very small. What passes for embodiment in machine learning ignores the details of how bodies are formed, adapted, and maintained. This labor is instead performed by humans, who establish the conditions for its comparatively simple methods to work. I propose to call these machines glamour muscles, because in their effort to emulate life, they merely copy or refine its superficial form and function. They don't meaningfully participate in their own design, function, and maintenance. This isn't to say that organisms are infinitely plastic or that we should aspire to build machines that are free from constraint. To the contrary, some manner of constraint above and beyond what is physically permitted provides the necessary conditions for life's possibility. But given any initial set of constraints on a system, things like its rules of operation, material properties, social obligations, etc., the essential question is whether its future evolution can be plausibly derived from this set of constraints and knowledge of its originary state. In theory, this is true for AI, because the logic by which it operates is fully determined by constraints it cannot challenge, violate, or transform, and that we as users do not alter over the course of its operation. No currently existing language model will ever, without expert modification, commit itself to anything other than language, even if it would be adaptive to do so. This applies with equal force to nominally embodied machines like robots, and even those that are called self-organizing, but which, owing to their fixed properties and rules of operation, are instead understood as instances of smart assembly. Satisfying this condition of unpredictability in practice doesn't require unpredictability in principle or the possession of an immaterial will. It depends on a fundamental indeterminacy of form and function, which resolves itself through material interaction, both with the surrounding environment, to the extent we want to make that kind of distinction, and among its ever-shifting and mutable parts. Susan Oyama, in her book The Ontogeny of Information, refers to this dynamic as reciprocal selection, with organisms selecting their environments and environments selecting their organisms. It's also the same sort of idea that underlies the total imbrication of action and perception referred to earlier, but enlarged to include what it means to perceive and act. So one way to respond to what I've just said is that the independence of system constraint from activity internal to the system isn't really a problem. If we consider the extended system, the machine plus the human, then it's already embodied in the way that I seem to care about. But the idea of an extended system is only useful to the extent that you don't care about the distribution of properties among the system's parts. Taken seriously, this would mean that the invention of large language models doesn't actually constitute progress of any kind, because we can obtain the same effect by scaling up the population who reads and uses Microsoft Word. This is obviously perverse and shows that what we care about is not simply a function of how well an objective is satisfied, but the manner in which it is satisfied. Just like with the computer metaphor, or what Robert Rosen calls psychomimesis, superficial similarity tells you nothing about actual causal properties. The reason it matters, or could matter, whether our tools are embodied in the way I've described, is that it makes possible the development of fundamentally new capabilities. From an engineering perspective, reciprocally selective tools would simply be a continuation of recent efforts that try to soften the tyranny of human judgment. But there are broader implications, because the knowledge and resources required to specify machine design in the traditional way are not uniformly distributed in the population or among its diverse areas of interest. It's not just our technology, but also its users who are captive to the design choices of those who build it. In the same way that components of technology are precisely specified for the achievement of particular outcomes, so too are we enjoined to realize social practices that keep our technology recognizably what it was designed to be. Things like harvesting or fabricating necessary materials, assembling and repairing machines, sustaining a culture of software use and development, etc. For a regular user, it would be much more preferable for me and the community to which I belong to determine what a given technology does according to needs and desires I recognize as my own. But this cannot be done if the technology I use is insensitive to what I require, or is only sensitive in a narrowly prescribed fashion. I'm going to finish by giving some of the flavor of the research I'm now pursuing, but without any specific details. So let's consider three types of systems that differ in a lot of ways, but most relevantly for this discussion and how much agency we ascribe to them. So as someone without detailed knowledge of how this system works, this TV, let's think about how different forms of coercion might be used to get this thing to do what I want it to do. Maybe it's malfunctioning, or I want it to do something new. One approach might be to reason with it. Obviously, this won't work. The system has no capacity for reason or the means to acquire it. Okay, what if I use violence? This will probably just break the thing, and once it's broken, it will stay that way until someone with technical knowledge comes around to fix it. Of course, many of us know that smacking the side of a TV might actually get it to work on occasion, but this isn't a reliable method, and certainly the threat of violence has no purchase because, again, it lacks the capacity for reason. Now, what if we make it so that a form of violence is visited upon the TV? Let's say we remove its access to energy, except in the case that it does something I want it to. For the same reason that the threat of violence will do nothing except by accident, neither will this arrangement, which incidentally is the very arrangement that dominates all of our lives. The best way to fix a TV or to get it to do something new is to approach it like an engineer. So what if instead of a TV, we consider a language model? All three forms of social coercion fail for basically the same reasons. Just like smacking the TV, we might enjoy some success in trying to reason with it, but this isn't reliable. Not because language models sometimes elect not to respond to reason, much like a person would, but because using reason, just like smacking a TV, doesn't necessarily target the causal processes by which relevant activity is generated. Our chance of success will certainly be higher, provided our goal is to get the model to generate language, but reason will be utterly ineffective to induce new activities. Similarly, making access to the means of subsistence conditional on performant behavior will either yield a system that doesn't work because our actions have broken it, or that works by accident. This is because language models aren't configured to care for their own subsistence, nor can they acquire the capacity to care, unless we design them to. Again, we require the tools of an engineer. Finally, let's consider human beings. Now the tools of the engineer are no longer adequate, but all three forms of social coercion are, under different conditions, sufficient to regulate activity. Intriguingly, the less overtly human activity is controlled by social means, the more effective it is as a form of control. Under feudalism, for example, rents and fees were extracted by force or the threat of it, while under capitalism, surplus value is extracted by making the labor you perform for your own subsistence equivalent to the labor required to produce a profit. Detailed knowledge of what an individual's objectives are or how they satisfy them isn't required. All that's necessary for control is that whatever an individual requires, they can only obtain by selling their labor, which is to say, by satisfying the objectives of those who purchase it. The worker's means of subsistence then becomes identical to the satisfaction of the buyer's objective. As we move toward devices that have no pre-given form or function, that is, when we intentionally limit or set aside the tools of the engineer, thereby forsaking detailed knowledge, I think we're likely to find that this last form of coercion, which is a blight on human freedom, will be an effective way to regulate 21st century machines. But first we have to reckon with the structural differences that make this an effective form of control for humans, but not for TVs or language models. Thank you for listening to me ramble for about 20 minutes. I'd like to thank my advisor, Nick Cheney, and my past advisor and future collaborator, Josh Bongard. Thank you.